This conference
Get
will now be
going. We
recorded.
know who Brian is. We know the title of his dissertation, and we've read it. And we know what it's about. And so the purpose of this is to conduct an oral defense. We're going to do some questioning about the study, everything about the study. And Brian's going to ask some questions. So who would would anyone want to volunteer to go first? Dr. Burrell or Dr. Topchian? Or would somebody rather go last?
No.
Does anybody have any opinion on that at all?
No.
I'll start. I'll start if that's okay with everybody.
Sure.
Yeah, that's good.
So why don't I do that? I'll get it started. So my question, Brian, would be this, and I'm probably only going to have one or two. But my question would be, any research, okay, almost any research is embedded in a history of research. It usually fits in somewhere. At the University of Phoenix, we like to say it's the gap, although there's lots of gaps, actually, in any line of research. And so my question to you is, how do you see your study historically? Where does it fit in? What's the subject? What's the line? What's the program of research that it is embedded in? Okay, long and short, recent and far away. So where do you see this fitting in, and why do we need to know about it?
All right, sir. Well, thank you. Before I get started, though, I am recording this, so I want to make sure that I have agreement with everybody that it's okay to record this audio. Is everybody okay with me recording this audio? If you have a problem, then I would encourage you to exit. But if you're okay, so Dr. Daly, do you approve?
I approve.
Yes,
Dr. Okay, Dr. Burrell?
Yes, I'm fine with it.
Okay, and then for my audience, I appreciate your participation. If you're on the phone still and you're listening in, I'm going to take it that you do approve. If you do not approve of the audio being recorded, then I ask that you politely exit, and I will have this recorded, and you can view it later. And finally, doctors, I want to acknowledge my father, who's also listening, Bill Ramsey. He's been a very valuable person in my life to this point. And so this whole combination, we tried to have this last night, I know, because Dr. Daly, you had a emergency come up. It was actually his birthday last night. That's why it was so important for me to have it on that day. So he celebrated 71 years yesterday. So I want to acknowledge him and the support that he and my stepmother Vicky have had through the years. And certainly with that, I'll go into your question. Okay, we all set?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So you asked me about the long and short of the gap and where this feels in history. For the longest time, from the 1940s, computers have evolved in various ways. One way that started in the late 40s to early 50s was through IBM, who began to develop a type of virtualization that occurred. And it wasn't what we would see as it is today, but certainly it was an opportunity for us to not have such large computers to run all these different programs and systems. So where my research comes into play is there's an opportunity here for medical facilities to take advantage of software virtualization and how it could increase patient care through quicker diagnoses or the reliability of data through software virtualization. So as I began to research the history around this, I found out that there wasn't a lot of data around the connection or relationship between the patient diagnosis process and software virtualization. As we continue to evolve and we continue to have large chunks of data and large amounts of data that traverses the network, we have to be even more precise in how we're processing that data, and it can develop into other recommended areas, which we'll talk about towards the end of this. So I hope I've answered your question. It basically, from the start, they've had some philosophies around IBM's processes and procedures that they can develop these virtualization that will inherently assist in not directly impacting hardware, but to run quicker and more efficiently inside software virtualization.
Okay. How about things like, because whenever you bring up the subject of diagnosis, okay, because your dissertation is as much about virtualization as it is about diagnosis. I mean,
Correct.
conceivably, you could have done some kind of a million different studies on something that would improve medical diagnosis.
Right.
Okay, so I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about medical diagnosis. I mean, it's about
Sure.
virtualization and medical diagnosis. The way I see it, it's primarily about medical diagnosis, not about virtualization. What you seem to be saying is that virtualization is a good thing for medical diagnosis, okay, for computerized medical diagnosis. And many things are a good thing for computerized medical diagnosis. The programs are good things. Okay, the whole history of expert systems is a good thing. So where does it fit in the several decades that these programs have been started to being developed? Perhaps you could name someone, a researcher, or a study, or a line of research. It seems to me, you could disagree, but it seems to me that several terms do come to mind: expert systems. A lot of early diagnostic programs are expert systems, although that term seems to be going out of style. Computer-aided diagnosis. These are lines of research. Just go into Wikipedia, you see a whole Wikipedia article on computer-aided diagnosis, and it may or may not mention virtualization. Go into the Wikipedia on expert systems, you'll see several paragraphs on that. So I'd like you to answer it. Take one more stab at that and fit it into the research on computer-aided diagnosis and expert systems.
Okay, sure. So starting way back when computer diagnoses was occurring, it started with basically pen and paper, right? It was all paper-based. Then as computers came on board, it began to be computer-based to some degree. And now with virtualization, the reason why medical diagnoses is such an important factor here is because a lot of hospitals, they want to be able to diagnose patients as accurate as they can, but as efficiently as they can. And so these expert systems, or this artificial intelligence, as we've talked about as well, they've got applications and systems developed now to where they will automatically diagnose patients. When I was working at Fuji, just one second. If we've got some folks on the phone, can you please mute your phone or the computer, please? And so with the systems that are currently available, when I worked at Fujifilm, there was a lot of applications that were developed that allowed the systems to automatically diagnose patients. And so one of the things I saw as I worked with this organization and many, about 1,500 hospitals across the United States, was that the diagnoses was taking a little longer than what I thought it should. I also found out that a lot of the doctors that I spoke to, they weren't sure if the data was as accurate as they thought it should be, or they also thought that maybe the data wasn't all the time available to them, like there were servers offline, it wasn't very reliable. So when I began to look at this early on and see the combination, I also began talking to the infrastructure people to determine how does this medical diagnosis occur, and what are the systems behind this diagnosis applications. So as we started developing from paper to computer, it seemed as though the systems that were being used had so much data they had to develop that data wasn't being processed as fast enough as it could have been with other types of systems like virtualization. And so from my experience in researching this, I found out that amount of data wasn't being processed accurately. So they actually still needed to go in and redo some of the notes and some of the diagnoses because they weren't very accurate. And so where I wanted
now in
to
the past, Brian, you've mentioned a couple expert systems that you've come across.
Mm-hmm.
Mention one or two.
Yeah, I did. I mentioned Fujifilms and Konica Minolta's, and there's many others out there. But yeah, those are the two that I've worked with. And
they would be mentioned in your literature search.
So I go into detail with Fujifilms, not multiple ones, but I go into some examples of Fuji's.
Well, even if you don't go into detail, just mentioning it for a line or two is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about Watson? Can you make a comment on IBM Watson, which is being used for medical diagnosis, among other things, among playing chess and everything else? Okay. Make a comment on that.
Yeah, IBM Watson is it's still ongoing in development, but you're right, it is in use because there had to be these massive systems that could process significant amount of data very quickly. So IBM has developed this Watson system like this. What I always related to was the War Games show that you saw on television in the 80s, where they had a game playing chess and trying to have all these bombs occur within the simulation. And so that's what's happening here is you've got these big systems, and one in particular called IBM Watson, which is in my research, that shows that it can take these very large amounts of data. It can interpret that, it can manipulate that in such speeds that our normal atmospheres can't, or normal systems can't. And so where I like to see this go is how can I relate that even in the future research and get that where it works even more efficiently in virtualization? Because right now, they're kind of concerned with some of the virtualization slowing down the IBM Watson's processing power because it hasn't got to that point yet. And so I think there's an opportunity
for IBM. Is that right? So
IBM.
Virtualization is being used by Watson, but it may not be an entirely good thing because it may slow it down.
Yeah, and they're seeing
that's
that
interesting.
in some
Virtualization may have its pros and cons, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Let's see. I think I'll pass it on, and let's go to who would like to go next? Dr. Topchin? Topchin. I'm sorry.
You want me to ask questions up front, or you want us to let Byron present the study?
You know, you have a point there. I should let him go through. So, okay, now that I've started it and asked my questions, it would be a good logical place. Thank you, Dr. Doctor. I almost forgot about his PowerPoint. I'm so anxious to get to the questions. All right, I have the PowerPoint up on my screen, and I hope everyone else does. And take it away, Byron. Brian.
It's actually pronounced Brian. That's right. That Y will trip us up for the rest of my life. I'm
sure. Yes, it will.
But,
yeah.
All right. So
why don't you do that? Why don't we get into the PowerPoint?
All right, I shall. So thanks again, everybody, for joining. Again, the title of my research is an E-Delphi study on software virtualization in the medical diagnosis process, the expert's perspective. And again, this is my oral defense for my doctoral dissertation. First, my acknowledgments go to my committee members. Thank you all very much for all the comments and providing me really late nights and long weekends to do all these edits and wonderful things. But when you kind of peel off the covers of what I've been doing, I certainly couldn't get to this point without your all's leadership. So again, thank you all so much for your help. So I want to start out, as I began to look at the process or the way the PowerPoint was supposed to be laid out, I kind of took the liberty, if you will, to kind of do a little bit of a different approach to this this study. I have all the main points, but I wanted to
Mhm.
kind of put this in a presentation in an order that I felt was a little bit more interesting to me than what I saw in the classroom. So I hope you'll enthuse me for just a little bit and entertain me so that I can do it in this particular perspective. So first of all, I want to cover what my research question is. And the reason why I want to do this first is because throughout the entire presentation today in the research, this question has always been to the front of my mind because all of my research must hinge on this single question. So my research question is, what advantages and disadvantages did physicians experience when using software virtualization during the patient diagnosis process? Now, why am I studying this? The general problem I found is that patient diagnoses are delayed, they're unreliable, or they're underperforming on server hardware. And I was able to do that by a couple different methods, and I'll get to those in just a moment. The specific issue I have is that there's not enough or insufficient empirical evidence on experts' opinions exist on the effects of software virtualization or the relationship, of software virtualization on the patient diagnosis process. And why is this important? Who is going to suffer or what's going to suffer? Well, first of all, if patients aren't given accurate diagnoses, if they're not given reliable diagnoses, their health care could be in jeopardy. It could reduce the patient's health care. Second, hospitals are liable for medical malpractice because if a patient's diagnosed incorrectly, the hospital could be held liable as well. And then I questioned, are there any others that could suffer or have ill issues when it comes to this type of situation? And another one that came to mind as I reviewed this today was maybe the insurance companies. The insurance companies would have higher rates because of malpractice or insurance that is covering or diagnoses that are not accurate, and then they have to pay a second time. So I feel that maybe insurance companies would have an ill effect on this as well. So as we go through, this is why I'm studying this, to see what is it that this relationship has between the software virtualization and the patient diagnosis process. What research method and designs did I use? First of all, it is a qualitative eDelphi study. It's qualitative because I wanted to be able to have the opportunity to have a study and a research that's going to allow me to interact somehow. I could have done a quantitative to some degree, but I was a little bit more than just the numbers. The qualitative research method is appropriate for this research study because the information regarding the advantages and disadvantages in that relationship is not numerical data. It's actually a Delphi study that allows us to put out a questionnaire that will allow me to question a group of experts. So to appropriately research the problem, the eDelphi method is best to understand the advantages and disadvantages of using virtualization in hospitals with a panel of experts. I want to know their opinions and their experiences and how that interacts with the organizations. Now, I do want to add here, how did I select the experts and what was the criteria? First of all, the selection process, how did I select them? I chose them through previous professional relationships. I mentioned that I worked at a couple organizations like Fuji and Konica Minolta, so I interacted with a lot of cardiologists and radiologists. And in that interaction, I began to talk to some of the physicians and some of the specialists on their experiences, so I began to get some information on who I might have in this study. Second is I chose through current medical relationships. I have a doctor myself, a cardiologist that I see on a regular basis who does medical diagnoses. And so when I began and got the approval of IRB, I went through and I actually contacted him if he would be willing to be a part of my expert panel. And then finally, the snowball effect. The snowball effect started because in these relationships and professional relationships, I also had relationships with a lot of virtualization experts. And as I was talking to one, and if they would be willing to join my study, they also said, well, hey, what about this person? And then that person said, what about this person? So that snowball effect began to get larger and larger, where I was able to get an expert panel size of about 12 people. Now, what about my expert panel criteria? First, they must be either a certified physician through the medical board, or they must be a certified virtual expert through VMware or Microsoft. So the two doctors that I had on my panel, they did provide me with their certification, and the 10 experts of virtualization also provided me their certifications with VMware or Microsoft. And there was one more criteria, is that the current medical diagnostic software must reside in software virtualization. Now, I'm not expecting my physicians to be virtualization experts, but I want them to have an idea of what virtualization is, or cloud services, or whatever the terminology that they're used to using. But I want to make sure that they had interactions with their IT staff to ask the question, is our medical diagnostic software in software virtualization? And so the two physicians that I chose, they do have virtualized software for patient diagnostic software, okay? So now let's talk about the framework. What is the process for me to use an eDelphi study? And I hope everybody can see this, this image pretty well. This is from Habibi, Safrizi, and Izadir, and this is an actual approach on how the eDelphi method will work. And this is a generalization. And then the next slide, I'm going to go into details on exactly the steps I took in my research. So first, the Delphi technique application are the requirements. I actually developed requirements. From there, it goes into a composition and the panel size of experts. From there, it goes into gathering the expert's opinion. And then the next is very important. It determines the level of consensus. Is there a consensus? If no, this is where the loop occurs with multiple rounds until you find a consensus. So is it a consensus? Over to the right, you see it says no. And you go back up to controlled feedback, and you start the process again. Until, in fact, you do have a consensus, then the statistical group response. So that's overall the eDelphi method and approach that most Delphi methods take on. Now, what was the approach that I took? So this is the actual approach that I took. First, I defined my problem. Second, I created my expert panel requirements. So once I created my requirements of the expert panel and I had the expert panel, I actually started to create the round one survey questions. And I'm going to go through what those are here in just a few moments. I submitted round one survey questions to the expert panel. I received their feedback. When I received their feedback and I used NVivo to do my software and my data analysis, there was not a consensus. So then I provided feedback to all 12 of my expert panel members. Then I asked them another survey. I created another survey according to the responses to kind of narrow down to the meat of what I need to try to get from them. Submitted the round two to the expert panel, and I received feedback a second time. And again, because I didn't receive a consensus, I'm now going into third round. So I created feedback. I created the third round of surveys with SurveyMonkey. I then submitted round three survey questions to the expert panel, and then I received feedback from the expert panel on round three. And once I saw round three data inside NVivo, I then realized that I did have a consensus at that point. So I analyzed the feedback and then the outcome and or trends from the NVivo software. On to the study purpose. The purpose of this study was to collect opinions and experiences from my group of experts. The expert panel did go through 3 rounds of survey questions with SurveyMonkey. Now let me explain my 3 rounds. First of all, round 1 was designed to question the position, the background, and software virtualization of the expert panel. If you recall, one of the criteria mentioned was they had to have some type of software virtualization knowledge, because I wanted to kind of tie in their experiences of the medical diagnostic software to that virtualization. Well, as that data came out, I did not get a consensus, so therefore it brought me into round 2. Round 2, I questioned more definitely, because one of the questions I asked in round 1 is I wanted to make sure I could bring out the advantages and disadvantages. I didn't get a consensus, so now I'm hitting more points here with the advantages and disadvantages, because that's that research question I'm trying to merge. And again, I did not receive a consensus. So then I moved into round 3. Round 3 was actually where I was able to form a consensus with a couple open-ended questions that allowed me to see that there was a consensus of the data for the advantages and disadvantages. Now, I also threw in another question in round 3 because I wanted their ideas on what they believe the future of virtualization is for patient diagnostics. And so we'll cover that in just a few moments. Dr. Daly, you mentioned a little bit about the research. This is the research that I had done that kind of filled the gap. So I researched with big data, the large chunks of data, the expert systems, because those are 2 areas that are developing that also I believe is another area that we could research in the future related to virtualization, because I think these are 2 areas that's going to continue growing more and more and more. And we're already seeing it. I already mentioned Fujifilm and Konica Minolta. Expert systems are out there already diagnosing patients. Now, I want to say very quickly, though, that although those systems are diagnosing patients, the medical board does not allow that to be the final decision. They do require physicians to still give their visual eyes on the data and on the diagnoses to approve it. So right now, there's not any systems that actually do 100% diagnoses, and that's where they stay. But I feel potentially that might be where things are going to go. But we'll talk about that later. Historically, I did talk about in the 1940s when computers started and how things became more efficient. Computers created for efficiency, then supposedly reduced the amount of paper. The empirical research, lots of research shows that software virtualization in the background of it. We talked about the IBM Watson. We've talked about how the virtualization was starting out at a different process. Medical diagnosis process, it was paper, and then it's moved into computer systems. Because of the amount of efficiency needed to be increased, the shuffling of papers back and forth began to be a nightmare for organizations. So they turned to computers to help them more efficiently. And it's actually evolved quite a lot. It was mainframe, and now it's individual systems. And there's lots of research that shows that as we keep implementing newer systems, the amount of data and as quick as that data can be managed and crunched in, the quicker diagnoses can occur. I also studied 3D software virtualization because I think another expert system or artificial intelligence is 3D. 3D software virtualization is where, for example, you can take an image of a heart and you can turn that heart in different ways and look at all the different areas of that heart. So you can actually cross-examine the different sections of a heart versus slicing it through like a CAT scan or CT scan or something would. So 3D software virtualization is alive and working today, and it is in many systems, but I also believe there's a trend here. I believe in the trend of 3D software virtualization, for example, IBM's Power 5 or IBM Watson, these sorts of types of systems. It's going to enable us to do more with medical diagnoses and the medical internal organs and things of patients. Now, how does this relate to virtualization in itself? Because as you look at these devices and these hearts and the brain and all these different organs and things, the 3D capability is virtual. Means it's not really, you can touch it, the actual software itself, but it resides in a virtual platform in itself. It's certainly an up-and-coming area, and here's some of the research I've shown in this slide. Some terms that we need to talk about, some of the most uncommon terms, I do mention what's called a DICOM validation toolkit, or DVTK. It's basically it's used to regulate and receive the end of DICOM images. Now, DICOM is the digital imaging and communications in medicine. That's basically the imaging and the data. So when you walk in and have an X-ray done, that is something that is actually moved instead of to film into software, into data. And that's a lot of data because some X-rays can be a couple hundred images. So the DICOM is the language and the connection between that device and the software that's interpreting that for you. EHR, or electronic health records, is the actual diagnostic software or medical record software that's used to house patient medical records. Medical data is the medical data in general term referring to patient data. Medical informatics is basically a type of technology within the medical field. So medical informatics is a field of technology specifically designed for the medical environment. Picture archiving and communication system, or PACS. PACS is another name for radiology. So PACS is a low-cost economic method for storing medical images. So it can be used in radiology primarily, but you also hear PACS in cardiology as well. But that's the taking of all those images and actually making it into medical images so that you can see those when you diagnose patients. Servers, for the purposes of this qualitative research study, servers are a central computer system that houses medical data or the images that the medical information is stored on. And finally, virtual software or virtualization is a concept of technology where one physical hardware device, called a server, is configured with software that allows for multiple software servers to be installed or implemented. So there's a couple advantages here we're going to talk about. In my research, I found that as you implement software virtualization, it doesn't reside specifically on the hardware layer. Unlike traditional systems, the software was installed directly into hard drive, directly into the connectivity of the hardware. So the software was basically at ransom, if you will, of what the performing of the hardware was. In the case of virtualization, there's actually what's called a hyperconnection or a division between the software and the hardware, which means it can actually run that software more quickly on a quicker basis and crunch that data more quickly that can actually outrun what originally the hardware could perform at. So software virtualization has really come out in a way that it can increase performance, not just for medical diagnoses, but any platform that's used within it. So that's one of the last terms we're going to study and what is very important for this study today. So I'm going to talk to you now about the rounds. This is a list of my round one questions. And the purpose of round one, again, was so that I could get some information to basis the remaining rounds if necessary. First, I wanted to make sure that I had a good demographic of the occupational role of the physician or the expert for all of my panels. If it was a physician, I had 2 more questions because I wanted to get more information on their diagnosis phase. You know, what was involved in it? How long did it take? On average, how many patients did you diagnose per day? And we'll talk about some of the data in just a moment. And I find that very important because if I've got 2 physicians at 2 different hospitals, it does depend potentially on how much data that is being used that could affect that relationship or could have a relationship between the virtualization and the diagnosis of patients. I then also spoke to the virtualization experts. First of all, does your facility use virtualization? Even though I knew that going into this, I still wanted that hard evidence from my virtualization experts to ensure that I still have that viability within the study. I also asked, is the medical software running in virtualization? Because I made it very clear that that's one of the reasons I needed to have this relationship in the study, because I'm studying the diagnosis software in virtualization. Do you know what virtualization is? Now, this was a general question for everybody. Now, again, I don't require the physicians to be virtualization experts. I just want to get an idea if they really know what it means. But for my virtualization experts, I do expect them to have a very vivid approach and knowledge of it. I wanted an example because a lot of people think that some aspects of cloud services is the same as virtualization, and there are subtle differences. They're almost the same, but there are subtle differences. So I did want a couple examples, and that came through pretty prevalent in the study. If a physician describe your patient diagnosis process. Now, I found question 8 to be very important because depending on how the physician diagnosed the patient, it also potentially depends on some of the relationship of that virtualization, because I found out that in some studies, the patient wasn't diagnosed right away. They waited until the patient came back 2 days later, or they came back a week later. So that could affect some of the relationship that they may perceive being good or bad, whatever that relationship may be. Does virtualization have a relationship with the patient diagnosis process? Question 9 was very important to me because this is where I wanted to see if from their experiences, does a relationship exist and how is that relationship? And that was a very pointed, open-ended question that I received some good feedback. And then finally, what are the benefits of virtualization and how might the benefits of virtualization benefit the patient diagnosis process? So round 1 really opened up the expert panel to provide the data, and unfortunately I did not receive a consensus, but the questions that were most important to me for a consensus was around questions 6 through 11, 6 through 12, excuse me. Those were the ones that I really honed in on as being the importance of this study, and I didn't get a consensus with those, so that brought me into the second round. Okay, the second round asked again the occupational role. What is the disadvantages of using virtualization? Because I couldn't get a consensus on the advantages and disadvantages, I now really wanted to pull out of that the disadvantages. I did see some answers come out and some data on the advantages, but I really wanted to see what are the advantages and disadvantages. So this provided me a good opportunity to get some disadvantages and to point my subjects directly into this direction. And then third, how do you believe virtualization can impact the patient encounter or patient diagnosis process? Again, I wasn't getting what I wanted about the relationship, so I reworded this in a way with providing feedback, and this did produce some results, but again, in round 2, I did not receive any consensus. Round 3, the final was, if you're pitching this as an opportunity to CEOs, what information would you present to remove the issues around having all the eggs in one basket with virtualization? The reason why I put this in here is we've talked about advantages, we've talked about disadvantages, and I wanted to see how we can connect that together with virtualization and the patient diagnosis process. And so this question helped me to derive more information around those advantages and disadvantages without repeating a lot of information. And then finally, where do you see virtualization is going over the next 5 to 10 years? At the conclusion of this, because of question 1, I did form a consensus. I was finally able to receive the feedback that I needed that allowed me to see that we do have advantages and disadvantages in using the relationship between medical diagnoses and the patient encounter process. Now let's talk about the data analysis. My demographics show that out of 12, I had 2 physicians at 17%, and 83% were software virtualization experts. Round 1, I did start with 12 participants. At the end of round 1, I only had data from 11. We're going to talk about the potential issues as to why I had one person drop out in just a few moments. Round 2, I had 8 out of 11 participants. I had 11 people start, and at the end of round 2, I had 73% complete, or 8 out of 11. And then finally, in round 3, I had 11 participants that did stay in the game, but only 6 finished. Now, when I say finished, that means that they completed every question. Okay, because there was a couple people who a couple subjects who did complete 1 or 2 questions, but it still didn't form a consensus because they didn't answer some of the other questions I needed to conform that consensus. So for those who finished, there was 100% that participated. 100% of those participated affirmed they worked in a hospital, medical informatics environment. And then 62.5% of the panel believed that virtualization has a relationship with the patient diagnosis process. And what happened from those results is a few themes that emerged. And I could see that the consensus provides 3 primary themes. 1, it does increase the performance with the software virtualization. And so one of the literature research that I found is that according to Loveland, Doe, Lafer, Byrian, and Chan, that virtual software is a software that emulates hardware. And because it emulates the hardware, it does increase the performance. So relating the consensus back to my literature that I found in my literature review, I was able to see a direct correlation between the research and what the outcome is for theme number 1. Number 2, it increased data reliability. So one of the things, before I started this study years back, I began to listen to the physicians that they not always could get the data in front of them, that sometimes servers were offline, sometimes it wasn't reliable in various different methods. So when I was able to ask the questions about the advantages of software virtualization, I was able to see that finally in that last round that redundancy and reliability were very important as advantages of using software virtualization. So one of the theories or one of the research areas that I focused on initially in my background of the literature was organizations were fearful of this all eggs in one basket, which means if they had one host that had multiple servers, it very well could be lost in translation, or when one server goes offline, it takes everything offline. So with today's technology, you can have multiple hosts, and each of those hosts can take on the services of the other host. So in effect, you have 100% uptime across all platforms. So now I've got 100% reliability and the data being available to the physicians when they need it. So that actually emerged in also the round 3 when it talks about the advantages and disadvantages. The reliability of software virtualization did emerge. And finally, theme 3 was a reduction in cost. A lot of hospitals I found also, as I spoke to them, they were hesitant on the cost of the software versus hardware. And so as I began to research and to look at the background, I did find that there was hesitations from medical facilities for implementing software virtualization because it's new technology. They were concerned with the cost. But the research showed me that by doing so, they were able to reduce hardware costs. So as one of the questions out of round 3 showed, in fact, hospitals that were implementing this were reducing the physical hardware cost by a significant amount of money. And so I was able to relate the research and the literature prior to starting to after that, in fact, that theme did emerge from round 3 questions. All right, so these themes emerged as a result. What actually was the data that emerged? In round 1, I saw a lot about availability of the systems. The systems and the virtual is equally merged from the scatter analysis. So I used in vivo version 12, and I imported each of the rounds data, and I was able to use a scatter analysis. So the scatter analysis was the opportunity or the ability for the software to look at the amount of time that the same word was used in the expert's responses. So as a result, each of those items were equally stated, 37.5%. I've got some more feedback, so if somebody could mute their phone, please, if they're not on the committee, I would appreciate that. And then round 2, the disadvantages. So I did see some disadvantages noted, and I found these to be very important. First, single node failure, the complexity of implementation. When you're implementing software virtualization, it is pointed and directed to a certain type of expert who can install it. So it is more complex. Its incomplete processes and procedures came out. There was a couple expert panel members who stated that in the event that some processes and procedures were not fully implemented, then the virtual servers that were implemented were not also adequate. So there had to be some very direct conversations and direct processes or procedures in place. And without those, you can have inadequate servers. Therefore, it could affect the performance and the ability to have redundant data. It requires specialized knowledge to support, as I mentioned, and it's misunderstood or inadequate knowledge can cause interruption of services. So these advantages were very important because it helped me to understand what we're seeing in experts and their relationship for the medical diagnoses in software virtualization. Round 3 data, it reduces administration, it's ease of availability of servers, reduction of hardware costs, disaster recovery, and business continuity. And this is very important because multiple times I talked to physicians that stated that they would have outages. They couldn't have access to patient data. And many facilities, when they actually had the capability, not only would they have medical diagnoses in software, but they would also have a copy of it in film. So they were doing it twice in case they were offline, they could go to film and diagnose their patient. Well, that increased cost as well. So by using virtualization, by having it reliable, by having it redundant, it was able to lower costs just not of hardware, but also of doing the redundancy of film. So there was more cost that they could save in the long run. It increased redundancy through multi-host environments and host availability. So this data emerged through the different rounds, but round 3 produced a consensus of the advantages of virtualization for the software for patient diagnoses. And these are the different types of data that emerged from that. The implications of the study. Well, virtualization provides reliable, expedient data for a physician. It also allows them to be able to diagnose more quickly and more reliably. Medical facilities leadership are more informed to make decisions based on the advantages of the software and the cost savings. The benefits of virtualizations include high availability, increased reliability, increased expandability, while lowering the cost of ownership of the organization. Now, traditionally, when you was implementing hardware servers, it could take 2 or 3 days to have a server in production. With software virtualization, you're able to do it in a matter of 20 minutes. So in the event of a quick implementation or a mass expansion that's going on, you can actually increase your own efficiency by implementing and creating servers more quickly as well. So let's talk about the conclusions. What's the significance to the study in the various areas? First of all, the significance for research. This is very significant to the research of the field of study for research for medical informatics and medical facilities, because they need to continue increasing the patient care quality. And they need to do that by delivering performance and patient data is more increasingly capable. What is the significance of the study for the theory that I'm studying? This research study is significant for the theory in that the study builds upon the theories of virtualization. As I mentioned, there was a lot of research done from the 1940s and 50s for virtualization and where it is today, and how the patient diagnosis process is being more advanced for various types of systems. Significance of the study of leadership. With this type of information, or the information that I hope was going to emerge from this, medical facility leadership and administration can make better decisions based on what they can provide for better health care for their patients and increase their savings and lower cost of the overall ownership of the virtualized software. The significance for the practice of the study is the research study is significant for practice for medical informatics experts and leaders in medical facilities. This research study contains significant empirical evidence that software virtualization can enhance patient care and increase the reliability of data for physician diagnoses. And that's a very critical part of this, because through my research, it does show exactly that it does increase reliability and it does increase the performance so that physicians can make better, more informed decisions and diagnose patients better. What are my recommendations for future research? Well, first of all, the research of the findings do align with the literature review. As you recall, I did find 3 emerging themes according to the literature review. What I also believe is I believe we can take this to the next level using the financial and manufacturing fields. A couple other areas that I have an expertise in are the financial and manufacturing fields. Those different fields use significant amount of data in various different ways. Where I currently work is a pharmaceutical manufacturing company. They make millions of vials of medicine per year. And that's a significant amount of data that our systems have to manage, and we are using virtualization, and I feel that this same type of virtualization can be used in other organizations to help them to process data more quickly as well. Artificial intelligence, I think we're all seeing this. Artificial intelligence is real from you talking to Google or Amazon's devices to even in hospitals who have automated systems who are diagnosing patients. But I believe artificial intelligence may assist in the processing of large amounts of data. There's additional research, I believe, that AI can actually perform better in potentially with software virtualization. So I think this is definitely a research area I'd like to see expanded on. Expert systems. Dr. Daly mentioned a lot about expert systems when we began. With the IBM Watson, I believe that eventually we'll get to where our software virtualization can perform in expectations of that massive computer system as you see with the IBM Watson. But I believe that other expert systems like Fuji, like Konica Minolta's, are already showing advantages for performing these diagnoses very quickly and very efficiently. I think these expert systems are going to be the wave of the future, from the littlest things to the largest things that's going to power and move our technology forward. I believe there is a relationship with software virtualization. I believe the expert systems may be able to process that data more efficient under extreme processing speed. I just see the future of these expert systems being so massive and so large that who knows what the future is going to hold and how we're going to have these systems controlling our world. And finally, I want to study the relationship of software virtualization on data mining. So data mining manages large amounts of data in virtualization, and it may assist in the faster processing of that, similar to what AI may do or similar to what expert systems will do. But that data mining has to be efficient enough and accurate enough to produce the results of that data as quickly as possible. So I believe there is an option here, or an idea of doing some research on the relationship of data mining to software virtualization, and if that relationship is positive or negative. Systems will need to consistently increase computing power and efficiency, and I believe virtualization might be the way to go to formulate that response. What are my limitations? Well, the classification of the expert panel members controlled. I did control that very direct, as I mentioned initially when I interviewed my members. I controlled by designing the panel around the industry standards of the medical informatics field. So they had to be, again, certified in some way, either medical or virtual, but I controlled it. And I did interview some that did not have some of that criteria, and they were excused from the panel. The second point is the quantity of the expert panel. I started out with 12. By the end of round 3, there was less participant, and there was many reasons why. I didn't ask why, but I can only assume that potentially the limitations was due to the reduction of the panel being attributed to the amount of time. I limited the second and third round to very small amounts of time, but that first round was pretty lengthy, so I felt potentially they thought the remaining rounds might be as long, and they didn't have the time potentially. So I thought maybe that was a limitation. They also had personal or job commitments. I did give each round about a week to 10 days to complete, but maybe there was issues around their personal or job commitments that prevented them from participating. Or simply loss of interest. After a while, maybe they just said, this really isn't for me, I need to move on to something else. Or it could even be the length of the rounds, being that there's 3 rounds, but they didn't know how long it could be. It could have been 3 rounds, it could have been 10 rounds. They didn't probably want to get tied up in those many rounds. In my initial discussion with them, I explained that we knew we were going to have at least 1 round, but it could be 2, it could be 5, it could be 20 until we conformed to consensus. So they knew going in that there could be a length of time that they would need to spend on this research study. And the length of responses. So most of the expert panels did provide shorter responses, but I did find that some did provide larger responses. So although they did not provide lengthy responses to the open-ended question, analyzing the themes were more challenging and some were incomplete. Some of the responses had misspelled words. Some of the responses had maybe some bad grammar in it. And so because of those differences, the system didn't pull some of that data together because they weren't exactly the same words. So I had to look at that and analyze that a little bit more quickly, a little bit more closely as well. And it does limit the amount of information to analyze with this number of participants. So I feel that one of the things I would change going forward is how can I do this on a more national basis and have a larger panel of maybe 100 or 200 participants and have a consensus of that larger group over larger groups of hospitals and how that may affect it as well. So the reflection on the research process, I do want to reflect on it. It was very enlightening. I learned a lot, and the unfortunate part is, as Dr. Burrell and Dr. Daly knows, about 6 or 8 weeks into my last class, I had one of my research committee members leave the university. And so it was a scramble before class, and lucky for me, God provided Dr. Topchin, and that provided some good feedback and a good relationship going forward. The research process was successful outcome is dependent on the dissertation committee and the researchers understanding the experience. I leaned heavily on my committee, and I think we developed a close relationship of responsiveness. And to the committee, I'm forever indebted because you helped to guide me. I leaned on the university a lot with their processes and their procedures, and I asked a lot of questions. I bet the dissertation services people know me by first name. I questioned them so many times, I'm sure. The research process was full of trial and error. It really was for me because I was taking everything my committee said. I was taking a lot of what the the organization that University of Phoenix said, plus everything I was reading. I also took some information from some of my previous colleagues that went to the University of Phoenix as well. So it's trying to navigate my waters, knowing that my authority of knowledge was my committee, but also filling in the gaps of where I could actually do that. The research process was full of trial and error because the designing the surveys, using SurveyMonkey was a little bit of a challenge for me at first. And I had to contact their support team. But after they kind of gave me a good walkthrough and showed me some videos and some YouTube videos, I was able to capture what I needed very quickly and create those without much labor. And incidentally enough, a byproduct of this is I think now I'm the SurveyMonkey expert within my company. When everybody needs a survey for something, they seem to come to me to design it. So maybe that's the case. An effective library of reliable information. I really want to applaud the University of Phoenix and also the scholarly Google aspect of things, because our research needs to be scholarly. And the University of Phoenix has millions and millions of articles and oodles of information. So it was always my go-to for all of my research, and I really appreciate that. And it does require a plan. I think going in this initially years back, I was all over the place. I didn't have a plan. I would go through the classes and I would see a plan start to develop, but it wasn't until maybe a couple of years ago that I really needed to nail this down. And so that's when I started to go into a spin of how can I create a plan. And so with contacting dissertation services, and then I was able to get Drs. Burrell and Dr. Daly involved in it. They were very instrumental in helping me create a plan and how I was going to move forward. And although we had a grueling IRB process of about 9 months, it helped to prove that plan in place and was able to move it forward. So certainly I appreciate your all's assistance in that. Plans for the disseminating the research results were, first of all, journals. Let me come back to that in just a minute. On April 5th, I gave a speech at the Society of Government Economics at the 2019 annual conference in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. I would have to say this was the most important speech I had ever given in my life. What came out of that were a lot of networking opportunities. One, I was invited to come back to their 2020 conference in January in San Diego. The president of the SGE personally asked me because she had heard about my speech in my room, and she had decided that she wanted to ask me about it in more detail. So I was very flattered by that. But also, as I was networking and talking to other professionals, I had 4 organizations or 4 people come up to me who said that they would either like to co-author in a journal or expand my research. So there's opportunities that came out of this and just that one speech as well. So I think there are opportunities of doing more journals, more speeches, as well as some opportunities as research. I would like to approach hospitals and other organizations about the implementation of software virtualization, or maybe do this on a wider scale. And also the studies from this study further research more into big data, data science, expert systems and beyond. I think that this is just the tip of the iceberg on what we can do going forward in researching more information. And incidentally, if you don't know, I do have my Society of Government Economics speech on YouTube. If you're interested, let me know, and I'll be glad to send that to you. And so basically that concludes my study. I hope you found it enlightening, and at this point, I am prepared for questions.
Okay, Brian, thank you. You're also going to do a KWOB, are you not? Knowledge
yes.
Without Boundaries?
Yeah, Knowledge Without Boundaries. I forgot to add that. I did submit. I haven't heard back yet, but there's a virtual conference online. I think it's in June with the University of Phoenix. So yes, I'm going to be doing that in June as well.
Yeah, good. I think the connection to AI here, to artificial intelligence, is machine learning algorithm, where the program actually learns to make differential diagnosis. But that's another point here. And so why don't we go now to whoever's ready? That would be Dr. Topchian or Dr. Burrell. Who would be ready to proceed now?
That's fine. I can ask a couple of questions.
Okay.
So, when
Sure,
you,
Dr. Topchian. Go ahead. You can start on your questions.
Yeah. So about the sample and the questions. When I first saw the questions, actually you splitted the sample into two different groups because some were physicians and some were technicians, right? When you said that you did not find agreement between them, that could have been the reason. Because, I mean, when you do a Delphi study, like it's one thing when you would like really to bring in different people and see how much they would agree to certain things. But when you have different questions for different groups, then I was thinking, I mean, you would use, let's say your question one was for physicians because it started, maybe not one, but five, I don't remember. But like you were starting, if you are a physician, what do you think about X and Y? And then the next one was if you were, in other words, those people who were not physicians, they couldn't answer to your question. And I was thinking that that could have been difficult because how many people did you have in your sample?
12.
12. So, and then you had what, like equal number of physicians and or no?
No, I had 2 physicians and 10 experts of virtualization.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the difference in numbers probably was something that maybe sort of created some difficulty. Because in one case, you had 2 people agree, and then in another case, you had 6 people agree, or 12 or 8 people agree. I mean, that's slightly different group dynamics, probably. So if you were to redesign this study, what would you have done differently?
If to redesign the study, I would have done differently, I think, the structure of my questions. And when I actually finished round 1, Dr. Topchian, I found that I did see a disconnect between the virtualization experts and the physicians. That's why in looking at it, if you look at my screen, table 2 of the round 1 questions, that's why I decided going into the second round, questions 2 through 5, I couldn't use those as the potential consensus for this research because I've got 2 separate sets of questions. So to address your issue there, I think what I would have done different is may have redesigned these questions in a way so that I pulled them together, okay? And I did that some. If you look at questions 6 and 7 and then come down to 11 and 12, I do pull them together in some of those questions, but not all of them. So I noticed going into my second and third round that I did differentiate initially, and I would agree with you. I think that's where I didn't get a consensus is because there was an agreement because I had separated them. So I think going forward, I would redo this in a way that all of these questions would be as a group, as one panel, versus it seems as though I might have had 2 separate panels in round 1 questions.
So I actually designed the Delphi study myself, a modified Delphi, and learned a lot about it. And it's interesting because modified Delphi is something that you can come up with different modifications, and then if you can justify appropriately, then it can be accepted. So what people did, I think they also did that in medical field, and they were looking at either nurse competencies or something else, and they had a very large pool of participants. So initially they collected all the responses. I mean, they offered, of course, items so that people could select from them. And I don't know, like hundreds of people. And then from that, they designed their questionnaires, questions, and then they had expert panels come in and work on already, In other words, you are involving more people, more stakeholders in the field. And then you are bringing it down to expert panel who can say the final word. So that's something else. I mean, since you started exploring Delphi is a very interesting design. You can still do different Delphi. Delphi's, and then you can look at how they do. And when you said you wanted to, even you were thinking about one round would have been very uninteresting because you need more than
Of
one
course.
round.
Yeah.
You need at least 3 rounds to make sure that some things are being eliminated and some others are being addressed.
Exactly. Yes, ma'am. And one of the other things I would have changed also is I really struggled trying to get more physicians involved, and I struggled because when I would contact facilities, and I had to go through their IRB process, and it was just a never-ending list of no's. So it was a difficult. So I would want to partner, I think, with somebody in a more expert area of the Delphi study, so that I can understand how I could get more physicians. I really wanted to have 6 and 6, about 12 to 15, 16, even out. But I just couldn't get to that point, and I felt like I was going to be another 10 years trying to find physicians. So I certainly think that going forward, I would like to get a more balanced approach of the number of people involved in my expert panel.
And something else that you can do, I mean, don't forget another thing. Sometimes it's difficult to invite people in certain professions because they are very busy, or they are, I don't know, like professions create some type of behavior probably. And you could have found probably IT people participate more in your study than maybe physicians, or maybe I'm wrong. So that is another thing to consider. And then you have to find a way of maybe send something, ask them to type in. Someone sitting at home can spend some 10 minutes.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean,
involved in it certainly, and also the type of hospital. I found that when I researched and talked to hospitals, the teaching hospitals, let's take here in Kentucky, the University of Kentucky, when I talked to the chief of radiology, the chief of staff, he was more than willing to help me out. But then when I looked at more private hospitals, my staff is too busy. We're not going to do that. So I found that more university-based teaching hospitals are used to research. They're used to people coming in and doing studies, and they're more welcoming. So I think going forward, I would focus on more of just the research facilities than trying to do all kinds of different facilities.
Right. Okay. I'm good. I don't have any other questions.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Topchian. Topchian. I get that right. And Dr. Burrell.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And,
okay, so go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So first of all, I want to congratulate you on the great study, and congratulate Dr. Daly on his guidance, because to get to this point is not an easy journey. One of the things I hope you take the time to reflect on is, just how far you've come. And a lot of people don't really know this when you get in this process that, I think the completion rates now are 38% of people that start a doctorate across all disciplines complete. And so my only question to you is more of a philosophical one. Now that you're on the precipice of being done, what is it about this process that changed you? What is it about you getting your doctorate, doing this research? How did it change you personally or professionally? That's my only question.
Well, thank you. That was a very kind words. I certainly appreciate you being on my committee, Dr. Burrell. I reflected on that a little bit last week when I was trying to fill out some other information that I ran across. It does affect you in certain ways. And one of the people that's listening behind the scenes is one of my employees. When it comes down to me finding information, I learned that I needed to get the right kind of information in order to make a decision, in order to know what the root of situations are, or making sure that the information I'm receiving is valid and truthful. And throughout this entire process, the type of research being so scholarly, I can't imagine myself doing anything outside of that type of research, because it's helped to show me the right ways to research and the right ways to process information. I know a lot of the times we talk about the situationness of a situation or what you're studying. And that's what I try to do in a lot of instances is look at the situationness of it in the research and how that's going to benefit. Personally, or continually professionally, you don't see doctorates in the field of IT. You really don't. You know, you're seeing certified people and masters. And so this wasn't about a professional approach. This was more about a bucket list item. Was this something that I could take on to accomplish a terminal degree that's the end of all the school that I've been a part of? Being 46 years of age, I've now been in school 35 years. I think I'm done for the most part. And so that's the professional side of it. The personal side it's just basically I love studying. I love school. I've always been that type of person. But this has opened up opportunities for me that I never thought I could have. Giving speeches, giving opportunities to write more research papers and more journals. So for me, it's opened up many angles of opportunities as well as knowledge on how to research. And so as I go forward, I'm going to apply these same methods to other research so that I can really learn even more from those areas. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did.
Okay, Dr. Burrell, you said you only had one question. Would that do it, or do you have anything else you can think of?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. All right, now we, Dr. Burrell, Dr. Chapchian, and I have to discuss, Brian. So I'm going to send you an email as soon as, monitor your email, and as soon as you get an email from me saying, get back on.
And also turn.
Okay, then you will get back on. Are you off now?
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, great. Okay, you took notes. So you got my email then, and you got right back on, right?
Yes, sir. I'm here with you. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, yes, we can hear you, and all three of us are here, and we agree. Congratulations, Dr. Ramsey, and you are finished, and where we go from here is we report to the classroom with a summary, the oral defense rubric, and and then we do the final dissertation edits, which you and I will talk later about. Okay, those final dissertation edits, and we'll probably hear from the school on that, but it looks like it's very, very much downhill from here.
Okay, well, great.
So,
well, thank you.
So again, congratulations. Okay, and I think you're. I'm sorry. Would you say that again, Dr. Shopton?
I'm saying congratulations, Dr. Ramsey.
Yes, that's what you said.
Very happy, right? Excited.
You can't see me, apparently. I'm grinning from ear to ear at this point. So thank you all very much. You all have been very instrumental in this. Just so you're aware, I did incorporate. I know at some point, Dr. Daly, we're going to talk about edits. So can you talk more about that process for me? I mean, did you all have changes for this oral presentation, or does that come out of your comments? How does that work?
Well, pretty much, Drs. Burrell and Dr. Chapchian are pretty much finished with edits. Now, I have to, I'm required to go over edits. It's the next step. What I have to do is I have to look over, pretty much the procedure would be for me to look over everything that has been said so far, especially from the external reviewer, and make sure that you've complied. And if I think you've complied, there won't be any edits. If I think you haven't, then there'll be some edits. Okay, and so that'll be the procedure. So I have to do that.
Okay.
I have to go. I have to go match it up with what I've said, with what everyone said, and especially the external reviewer. And whatever comes out of that process after I look at it will be the final edits.
Okay, great.
And assuming we don't hear back from the School of Doctoral Studies saying they disagree with me or something, then it should be over, and then we move to the signature page and all that, and graduation. Yeah. So that would be
perfect.
So what I'll do is I'll get back in touch with you on that.
So you need
so I want to thank you, Dr. Ramsey.
Wait, sorry.
So, Dr. Ramsey, it's Dr. Burrell. I told Dr. Daly now to teach you the secret doctoral handshake, so you make sure he teaches it to you.
Okay, I sure will.
Yeah, you have to use that every time you see someone with a doctorate. Yes.
Congratulations, man. I mean, this is a wonderful day. I hope you celebrated a lot. I know it's a long time coming, and to me, I just, hopefully as you go out and you speak and you meet other people, you kind of tell your story, because obviously yours is one about perseverance. And the reason why it's important for you to tell that story is you'll meet a lot of people on LinkedIn in these different forums that are probably ready to give up. And when you tell them how you stayed the course and you made it, it might inspire them to keep going and finish too. So I want to encourage you to tell your story early and often. Obviously we've gotten to know you, so we know you're a humble person. And you telling your story is not about, wow, look at me, I got a doctorate. You telling your story is, I had all these challenges and I overcame them and I accomplished this. And if I did it, you can too. So congratulations. Enjoy this time.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. In fact, two of my esteemed student friends are on the line who face challenges, and at times they want to give up. So this was another method for them to listen in and be encouraged that they will reach their goals like I have. So certainly appreciate that. Appreciate it a lot.
Sure.
Okay, great. I hope it helps them too. Sure. And okay, well, Dr. Topchian, I want to thank you very much for everything you've done. Dr. Burrell, thank you very much, especially for that last speech, that last inspirational speech and the secret handshake and all that. And and I'm sure we'll be communicating sometime soon. With that, I'll I guess Brian, thank you again. Happy birthday to your father. And thanks to everyone in the audience there, all the Ramseys and the people who work with you. So I'll be getting back to you real soon, Brian, about the final edits. Okay?
All right, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Okay, bye, Rosanna. Thanks again. And bye, Daryl. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So, no.